Mrs. Doris Brinkley Kinsale, who was one of the first stewardess who ever flew with Pan Am. So, Mrs. Doris, you talked to me a little bit about your experiences flying with Pan Am. When did you first begin flying with them?
Oh, I'd love to tell this story. That was back in 1944 in April. The war was blazing in Europe, and the ladies were invited to, or asked to, do whatever they can for the war. And Pan American was taking females, so I applied and was one of the first group of 12. There were 7 taken and needed so badly until they were put right to work. They'd worked for other airlines, and so they were put right to work. But the second 12, which I was in, had to go in training. So at that time, Coconut Grove is where Pan American had one of their buildings, and they put Mr. McCorkadale down for training these 12 to be on flight. In about a month, we were on the line flying.
Coconut Grove, is that in Miami?
Yes, that's down close to where the Clippers came in on Biscayne Bay, Pan American Clippers. And I knew it well because I lived in the area. So it was convenient for me just to go down there. I love to go down there and watch the Pan American Clippers come in. Just a thrilling day.
Now, were you living there? Is that where you were living
Yes,
prior?
I was living there, and I worked downtown Miami at the time.
Okay. And are there different divisions of Pan Am? Did you work in a specific division?
Oh, yes, there's many, but Latin American was the one that began the whole stewardess thing. We were needed all through Latin America at the time. Pan American was putting in new airports all through Latin America and Central America and the Caribbean. So it was an exciting time for all of us.
Well, now, I noticed that the uniform styles for Pan Am for the stewardess have changed through the years. What did you think of the style and the quality of the uniforms that your group wore back in the 40s? Because it was back in the 40s, wasn't it, that you began flying with Pan Am?
Yes, it was 44 in April. Yes, I love the uniforms. They were designed by Christian Dior, who at the time was the world's greatest designer, in my opinion. And they were so practical, just so very, very practical. Even on our longest flights, Pan American flight to Buenos Aires, they were practical, they were comfortable in any weather, because we flew from New York to Buenos Aires, crossing the equator, so it had to be very practical and very comfortable.
So you were cool in them?
Cool enough, cool enough, and and they stayed clean. You could spill black coffee on them, and you could just wipe it off.
Now, back then, I don't think you wore nylons, did you?
No, I don't think we didn't wear girdles or gloves or any of that, or even pantyhose. We didn't have them back in that era.
Mm-hmm.
But the ladies since then, of course, styles change and they keep changing with the styles. But that was the 40s. The first groups were entirely different.
Now, you said you went through some training too. So, what did you do in your training? How long was your training, and what did you learn?
Well, for 5 weeks, we were in Mr. McCorkadale's group. We learned the terminology of the airplane, like the different parts of the airplane, and we were being taught Spanish by Mr. I can't think of his name, by Ebor. And we also learned to make sure we could swim. And since it was war times when I started, for a year after, we had to check all of the safety equipments like the fire extinguishers and things that later on they probably didn't use. So we checked that we had the right equipment and general things of that nature.
Now the flights, I know the airplanes then were not jets, and they were a little bit smaller than what we have today. How many passengers would typically fly, and how many stewardesses normally used on a flight?
Well, that depended on the flight, but in the first, when I first started, it was just 3 flights a day. One to Havana, and one to Nassau in the Bahamas, and that was with a DC-3. And our service at that time was just a glass of orange juice and some chiclets, of all things.
Ah, chiclets.
Chewing gum.
Why chiclets?
Well, the airplane was small, and
they weren't pressurized, were they, back then?
No, they weren't pressurized. So often the ears hurt when you ascend and descend. So chewing gum stabilized the ears, and it was just what we did.
Well, speaking of stabilization, a story you told me, which I found was quite interesting, was that if you went up, I know this is later on in your time with flying with Pan Am, but if you went high enough altitude, because there was no, because the airplanes were not pressurized, you had a specific incident that happened with you, where you were not getting enough oxygen. Is that correct?
Well, yes, but I was unfamiliar with the plane, and I had been sent over to Brownsville, Texas, and was on a flight that I didn't ordinarily go on, and there was no passengers, and it was a night flight. That was after the first year, and I realized that I was getting tired, exhausted, and freezing. Put a blanket around me, and I still was not comfortable. So I looked up in the cockpit to see what was the problem, and there they were with their oxygen mask on, and they couldn't believe that I didn't know how to put an oxygen mask on.
Oh my goodness.
But anyway, I learned, and I only stayed in Brownsville for a short time before I was sent back to Miami.
You didn't realize what was going on, though, did you?
No, I didn't.
And you were you didn't have enough oxygen. Is that correct?
That's correct. We were flying from Brownsville to Mexico City, and it was at night, and it was all so unfamiliar to me.
Mm-hmm.
On the port side, we had Popocatépetl, or the big high mountains and ice. So it was a eerie but interesting time to be flying.
It was actually during World War II, wasn't it?
Yes, that part was. And in Miami, being war times, we didn't, or Pan American didn't illuminate the field because of our being war times and having our enemies right off of our shores, like the submarines and a lot of dangerous things. So it was a different time in our world.
Well, because it was during World War II, and you said there was no night flying. Is that correct?
Well, the way I remembered, we had to be out at the airport on 36th Street at 4 o'clock in the morning. Mm-hmm. Now that's a story in itself, because getting out there. And Miami was a small town then. It wasn't the city that it is now 70 years later.
Mm-hmm.
So I had one time when I had to hitchhike, and I took my little suitcase and walked about 3 blocks and sat down in the middle of Old Dixie Highway. And I knew that the next person was going to take me to the airport. So a car came by shortly thereafter, and he did take me down to 36th Street, where I could get a direct lift down out to the 36th Street airport. And he fortunately had been a mechanic with Pan American, and we talked on the way down. And he said, "Well, your plane isn't going out for quite a few hours because I've worked on that plane, and it'll be a few hours, so you don't have to hurry." But that was the way it was back in those early days of me with Pan American.
Well, now, since this is during World War II, there was something that you all did called the ringing of the bell.
Yes.
And what was the purpose of
Well,
that? And what was that?
Well, usually on flights down as far as the canal zone, there may be convoys or something that the passengers classify that was not to be shown to the world. So the captain would ring the bell in a special ring, and then I quickly would close the blinds on the airplane so the passengers couldn't see.
Well, on those flights too, you also had a couple of celebrities that you came in contact with or close contact with. Who were they?
Oh, we did. We had lots of celebrities. Not well on one of the longer flights later on down to the Buenos Aires flight. We had Tyrone Power and Jean Arthur, and well, I could go on, but we really didn't bother with getting any signatures until later. And later, I flew for 3 years, so later in the flights, we had generals, and I did ask the general if he would sign my short snorter. And he said, "Of course I would love to, but this is the man you want." And that was a young man, and he said, the general said he is the number one ace in the European phase of the war. Of course, I was interested in that. So they signed my short snorter.
Well, just for those who don't know what a short snorter is, why don't you tell us what one of those are?
Oh, a short snorter in those days were a roll of dollar bills or monies from the various countries. Say if it were from America, then we had a dollar bill. But if it were from Guatemala, we had a quetzal, I think that's the name of their money, and they would sign that. And therefore, you then rolled it up and taped it together. And they call that a short snorter.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, it sounds like you had a lot of routes in South America. Your route involved South America and Central America. Did you fly at all in North America?
No, well, only into the ports, such as New York and Miami and New Orleans and Brownsville, Texas, were the ports that the Latin American division flew in. Of course, the other divisions flew in their own areas.
So what was your division? I mean, what are the different locations in South America and Central America that you would fly into?
Oh, well, let's see. Well, we'd fly from Miami to Camagüey, Cuba, and from there to Puerto Rico. And if I were going on a long flight, from Puerto Rico into New York back down the east coast of South America, all the way from Trinidad, Villim, Montevideo, and what did I miss? Montevideo, and then into Buenos Aires. Oh, I forgot Rio. Yeah, we did. We had a wonderful time in Rio, and then on down to Buenos Aires.
Well, there was something that I can't remember what you called it, but a place that they would set up. I think it was in Panama where they would set up the stewardess. You would stay together in a building.
Oh, no, that was in the Canal Zone.
Okay.
That was a very strategic spot in those days, most strategic spot in the world, because the war was in the Pacific and in the Atlantic for the first year of my flying. So the old Tivoli Hotel was home to a lot of us in those days. And I especially remember flying across the North Coast on VE Day, was Victory in Europe, leaving Panama. We had noticed that the boats were all a lineup of boats going to the Pacific, which was unusual. So we talked about it. Something big had happened. So going across the North Coast over to Trinidad, the bell rang, and a special ring. So when I got to the cockpit, we learned that the war was over in Europe. That was a thrill.
Oh,
Real thrill.
Time for a party, huh?
Knowing that I had family on both sides, Atlantic and Pacific, and it was a long flight across the North Coast and a long flight back the next day.
Mm-hmm.
So getting into the Tivoli Hotel, I was completely washed out, tired. So everybody was celebrating, but I was going to bed. So I went right to my room and went to bed. And a funny thing happened. About the time I got really good asleep, my door flew open and the bright light, overhead light came on. And this young man who had a snootful, he said, "You're going to get out of my room. I've had this engaged for a month. You're getting out." And I said, "Listen, buddy, go find your room. Go find your room. I'm tired." And he left, turned the light off, and closed the door. And about sometime later, the door flew open, the light came on, and he said, "I beg your pardon." I said, "All I ask you is leave and get your room." So that's the way it happened there.
Oh my goodness. That is a funny story. You had a few funny stories
I had a
actually
lot
that
of funny
happened.
stories.
Yeah, I remember one you told me about. Speaking of funny stories, you were on a flight and a passenger needed to go to the restroom, and he had a question for you. And what was?
Well, a passenger came up and said, "Stewardess, I think that you have a sick man up here in front of the. Would you please come up?" So I took my airsick bag and I went up as quickly as I could. And this strange man was looking around, and I asked him if he was sick in a couple of languages, and he didn't respond. So I opened the bag and I gave it to him for him to vomit in. And when I did, he was looking down at his pants and about ready to unzip it. And I said, no, the toilet. So he understood and was ushered back to the toilet.
Oh my goodness! I'm sure you stewardess had fun with that one.
We did. Well, there was only one on that flight. On the DC-3, there was always one. On the DC-4, there were two. And the old Boeing, I think there was just one on the old Boeing down to the Canal Zone, where we stayed at the Tivoli.
Well, I know you have a few funny stories, but you also had a couple dangerous encounters that took place.
Yes.
While in flight.
We try not to think of it, but we did have some dangerous encounters. Well, there was one that was near the Panama Canal. What nobody in those days. They, uh, Albrook Field was the American Army base. They intercepted us 40 minutes out. 40 minutes out, no one flew over the canal itself. So the men at Albrook Field would ask for the pilot on the Pan American plane to give the names of his crew members. So usually they would give the name of the first officer, the second officer, the third officer, and then say 2 stewardesses or 1 stewardess, whichever. And, and the Albrook Field man would come back and say, name the stewardesses. So we knew then that there was somebody who was looking for a date for the evening. Had a nice club there in Panama. Well, at the base.
Mm-hmm.
So
well, you also had a fire incident, didn't you?
Yes. Well, that was years later. I flew for 3 years, and over one of our flights, I don't remember which one. Everybody smoked in those years. There was cigarettes, and it was always cabin full of smoke, and ashtrays. But this night of the fire, somebody, it was during the night, and I kept, everybody was sleeping, but I was sitting back there just smelling this unusual smell for a cigarette fire. So I started looking and found a fire at the water, where we got water.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody had dropped a cigarette down on some of the cups that were just burning. So that was scary. And 2, through Central America one time, the door flew open. And that scared me.
That could suck someone out, can't it?
Yes, I heard that there had been a steward who had been sucked out in that area.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a couple. And then on the DC-3 over in Havana, we arrived in, I don't know, the usual time was about 45 minutes, and then flew around the tower for about an hour and a half, and the passengers were getting really hot, very, very uncomfortable. And I learned from the pilot that the landing gear was stuck. And they didn't know if it had come down or not. So they went around a few times more. And then we were told to prepare for a crash landing. I was told to prepare the passengers for a crash landing, which was very scary. But glad to say we landed with the landing gear down and all was well.
As far as, well, that's a good
That's a
ending to a very scary incident, that's for sure.
It is.
And when you landed, now some of those terminals you just had grass landing, didn't you?
Well, that was at Rancho Boyero. That was in Havana.
Oh, okay.
They didn't have. They just had the grass landing there for a long time. And later, in my flying days, they had another airport after a year or so.
Well, the story that you told earlier where you had a flat tire and you had someone pick you up and take you to the airport. You remember that story that you just recently told?
No, I changed that tire at 3 o'clock in the morning. I never changed a tire in my life, but on my car, by that time I had a car, uh, I had to change my own tire, and I did a great job with it. The only thing was I didn't know how to get the car off of the jack. So that was a bit of doing, but I got it done and got out there by 4:30.
You got to work by 4:30.
Right.
Well, the time that there was one morning you said you got there and there was nobody there but like one or two. There was only
Only
like
a
two.
few in
Yeah.
those first days. There were only a few people out there at the airport.
So the terminals were quite different then than they are now.
They were. Of course, we didn't have air conditioning then, and it was hot in Miami. But a little later, Venezuela put in a new, beautiful airport, all air conditioned.
Nice.
So that was very, very nice. And Pan American got one in Miami later. But those days were different than the ladies have today, or even back 20 years ago.
It's hard to imagine with the uniforms that you all were wearing and being on those airplanes with no air conditioning. You must have gotten very hot.
No, well, only in the cases like flying around in Havana, that was different. Mostly it was comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly it was very comfortable. And two, we didn't serve the meals as the later stewardesses did.
Mm.
The first 3 years, being wartimes, and well, of course, the war was over the first year I was flying, but Pan American got bigger planes. When I was flying, they were all land planes that I flew in. DC-3, Boeings that were just rickety at that time. The old Boeing that went to the Canal Zone had 4 booths, regular booths.
Mm-hmm.
With a row, that was 4 booths on the starboard side and a row of seats on the port side. And we seldom had many passengers in those days. So it worked out fine, but they were old planes. I never flew in the Clippers like the China Clipper. And I would go down and see them, but down on the bay, but I never flew with them. I never worked on them.
Well, I saw a really cute picture of you holding a little kitty cat while you were a steward. Very, very pretty picture. So did you all take animals on the airplanes at that time?
Oh, we did. Absolutely. I have a funny story. There was a man who was standing with, the 2 of us were standing back in the galley, and he said, I could swear I heard little chickens. And I said, little chickens? And then I laughed and I said, well, I do too. And actually we do have little chickens in the baggage compartment. And we may have other critters that we don't carry up with the passengers.
Oh my goodness, that is cute little chickens.
Yeah.
Oh, well, it sounds like you had a great time while at the time, during that time of your life when you were a stewardess with Pan Am.
We had a great time. There was always the Haraguan Hotel to go to. We looked forward. It was brand new. That was in Dominican Republic. And the Dominican Republic at that time was called Ciudad Trujillo because Trujillo was the dictator. And I have stories about that, which I won't go into now. I did have the pleasure of seeing Trujillo's Mahogany House.
Oh,
And
nice.
it was when Doris Day was singing Que Sera Sera. And my friend went with us, and we went with Trujillo's son to the Mahogany House. That was a wonderful evening, I remember. Just lots of things like that. We rode Trujillo's horses, which I have pictures of. And I have a great many pictures that are just too numerous to haul out, to tell you the truth. But I do have some that we can put with our, with our story.
Well, we won't get into the story right now, but I'll just say that you also met your wonderful husband while you were with
That's
Pan
one of
Am,
the
didn't
good
you?
things about it. Yes, indeed.
Yes,
I
you
met
did.
Charles, and we've been married 66 years, I met him at the Staff House, which is a small hotel in Piarco, on the Trinidad. And it was just something that was very unexpected for me, because I thought that, well, both thought we were engaged to somebody else. And it turned out that we got married.
And that's a story that we're gonna tell everyone later. And I just thought that was very interesting that you had met him
Yes.
while you were still with Pan Am. So, well, what would you say would be your fondest memory working with Pan Am?
Oh, there's just so many. But my fondest memory, I suppose, was the group of us played Pateca in Rio on the Copacabana beach. And just having fun, unwinding after the flight down there, playing Pateca, which was a very informal hitting of the ball on the Copacabana beach.
Well, Mrs. Doris, thank you for sharing that information with us today.
I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too.
Uh-huh.
And if there's, we're going to continue, our discussion. We're going to continue our discussion and share a few more stories later on about Pan Am, and we're going to talk a little bit about you and your husband
Good.
and your adventures in life.
Good.
Okay.
Good.
All right.